This is a question that a lot of us ask ourselves, well, who should I vote for? And may give you some surprising thoughts about that. The Bible tells us who to vote for. Of course, it doesn't call them out by name, but God still gives us his principles to guide us just the same. But we first need to look at God's creation to see God's overall plan. See, God ordained the family, government, and the church. And through these, he would give direction for man. Of course, the family was the first that God ordained. And he put man at the head, the lead, not to be a boss and a dictator, but he was to plant the example seed. And man was to seek God's direction. Man was to learn all of God's ways. And man was to follow God's principles. And then God would bless him all of his days. And of course, man was to love his wife unconditionally, just the way that Christ loves us. Certainly not to be selfish and self-centered, and sometimes throw his wife under the bus. And then the family was to educate the children. See, that was not government's role. And then the family was to teach God's principles and to love God with their whole heart and soul. Now, that does not mean that you must homeschool, but we must be very involved in what they're learning. And what they are studying should not be decided by Washington. But we as parents must be much more discerning. Then God also sanctioned the government. I see that it had two roles. And government, too, was to follow God's principles and to disregard the polls. Now, one role was to have a military. It was to be second to none. So if you had to go into battle, it would be one and done. The other role was to punish evildoers. See, we must be a people with laws. And when people choose to break them, then that justice would clamp you in its jaws. Then God ordained the church. Of course, a priority was the needs of the people. Not new, extravagant buildings with million-dollar steeples. But the church was to minister to the people. The church was to feed the poor. And the church was to help rebuild communities. But we don't do that much anymore. See, we've turned that over to big government. Then we wonder why our taxes are so high. And if you think government can do it better than the church, well, you're believing a bureaucratic lie. But the thing I think will break us financially are all these entitlements that the government was never to do. And if we're going to change our direction, I think it's going to depend on me and you. And then God also told Israel as a nation, money you should not borrow, because the borrower becomes a slave to the lender. And later on, it'll bring on sorrow. Now, the instructions that God gave to Israel thousands of years ago are just as applicable to us today. But there's one thing we need to know. We need to let families be in charge of education. We need the church to feed the poor. And then let's let the government keep the people safe. and not be involved in any more. So you see, the Bible does tell us who to vote for, if we'll just follow His design. Then God will bless us once again, if with Him we will align. Of course, we are not going to find the perfect candidate, but choose the one closest to God's design. And you pray for them, and you support them, and you pray that God will keep them in line.